Thank you everyone for signing on for today's webinar. I'll move it over to Professor Doug Kreiner to start us off.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's Teletown Hall, examining the threat of foreign interference in the 2020 elections and the unique challenges facing our electoral system during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Doug Kreiner, and I'm the Professor of Government at Cornell University and the Faculty Director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Today we have an extraordinary opportunity to hear from the Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Representative Adam Schiff, to engage these critical questions facing our democratic institution. Ironically, it's a conversation we'd fully intended to have on the Ithaca campus last fall before a few other events arose that gave us some additional food for fodder. Congressman Schiff, thanks so much for taking the time out to be with us today and to finally get around to this critical question about foreign interference. It's now my pleasure to introduce Representative Steve Israel, our Institute Director, to get us started.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kreiner, and again, thank you for everything that you do as the Faculty Director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University. I just want to begin by acknowledging some special guests that are participating today. Former Congressman Tom Coleman, a Republican from Missouri, former Congressman Bill Enyart, a Democrat from Illinois, and former Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty, Democrat from Connecticut. We're also very fortunate to have Ed Cox, who was the Republican chairman of the New York State Republican Committee, as well as several trustees and leaders of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, including our extraordinary chairman, the former Lieutenant Governor of New York, Dick Ravitch, Bernard Schwartz, whose support allows us to do events like this, Marty Scheinman, Andrew Tisch, Wendy Abrams, who you're going to hear from shortly, and Zach Layton. The Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell has one vital mission, and that is to curate bipartisan programs designed to deepen discourse and raise understanding on critical issues. And so, although we just launched in March of 2019, we've had an array of amazing guests. Congressman Schiff joined us in Ithaca last year. A few weeks after she became Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi joined us in New York. Reince Priebus, the former Chief of Staff to President Trump, joined us in New York. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy, business leaders, diplomats, ambassadors. We do book and author series. We publish the Bipartisan Policy Review, a compilation of articles about bipartisan approaches to critical issues. Last week, we featured 4 members of the Congressional Black Caucus discussing race and justice in America. We have 2 events coming up. Please put this in your schedule on Friday, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, a forum called Democracy 2020, the Protests and U.S. Democracy. That's tomorrow at 1. And Wednesday, July 1st, we'll be taking an inside look at the 2020 presidential election featuring David Axelrod, a Democrat, former Republican Congressman Tom Davis, a Republican. We're doing that in conjunction with the University of Tel Aviv. It's for a primarily Israeli audience, but it is open to all. So please join us on July 1st, and you can get information by visiting us at iopga.cornell.edu. Again, iopga.cornell.edu. Today we discuss election and foreign interference with Congressman Schiff, and I have asked one of our leaders and founders, Wendy Abrams from Chicago, to formally introduce the congressman, and then he and I will have a conversation and then open it up to questions and answers. Wendy, we go to you.
Thanks, Dave. It is my honor and pleasure Congressman Schiff is somebody I have tremendous respect and admiration for and consider a good friend. So thank you for your friendship as well. Congressman Schiff represents California's 28th district since 2013, but has been in Congress since 2001 when he was a freshman with Congressman Israel. As I think everyone on the call knows, he is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, formerly served on Appropriations and Foreign Affairs Committees as well. And as the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, led the investigations of the impeachment inquiry against President Trump. And I, in my personal editorial, I think, am truly grateful for the representation that both eloquent and articulate and represented Congress and their nation in just a tremendously patriotic duty, and I'm really grateful to you for that. I think it will be historic. What your actions and speeches were truly historic. So I don't think there's anyone better to talk about election integrity than somebody with so much personal integrity, and I'm grateful to have you here today.
Wendy, thank you so much for your friendship and for those enormously kind words. And Steve, thank you for inviting me to join you again. I feel honored to be among those, that list of distinguished people you've had come before the Institute. And I look forward when I can come back and meet with folks in person again, as we like to say, on the other side of the curve.
Mm-hmm.
But, let me just maybe start out with a few observations, and then I look forward to our discussion. What we saw in 2016 was a systemic interference in our election by a hostile foreign power, that being Russia. This was, not new in the sense that Russia had intervened in our affairs to various degrees in different ways ever since the early days of the Soviet Union. But this was of a breathtaking scope and character, far beyond, I think, what Russia had ever done. It demonstrated a lack of risk aversion in terms of what blowback Russia might face, and how these tools could be used, these kind of new century tools, in a very effective way that would give them both an opportunity to meddle in our democracy without leaving their cubicles in St. Petersburg, do so with some level of deniability, and impersonate Americans through false flag operations, spark protests, albeit small ones in the United States, generate millions and hundreds of millions of views and impressions in their social media campaign, influence the discussion on the campaign trail of candidates by hacking and dumping documents from the DNC and the Clinton campaign, and exercise a phenomenal influence. And so this was quite unprecedented. It took us by surprise. We did see it in real time, although I don't think we saw the full degree of it until the postmortem afterwards. But we cannot say that we go into the next election blindfolded or unaware of what the Russians or other adversaries might do. Indeed, the Russians have never stopped meddling with us through social media. Whether they will similarly engage in hacking and dumping operations, or use completely new tactics like deep fake technology, which would allow them to produce highly realistic but utterly fraudulent video or audio and insert it into the social media bloodstream, or use completely other tactics, we don't know yet. We know that they will interfere because the interference is ongoing. But we also don't know whether other actors will get into the act for themselves. And of paramount concern is what China might do, or what Iran might do, what even North Korea might do, as well as other potential bad actors. The cyber realm is really the asymmetric battlefield of all asymmetric battlefields. A small investment, and even though the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg had a multi-million-dollar budget, compared to a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar presidential campaign, that's a small budget to have such an outsized influence. So these cyber means offer great utility to countries that do not mean us well, to involve themselves, to help shape outcomes, to do so with relatively little risk, depending on how aggressive they choose to be. So we are working with the intelligence agencies to try to get real-time intelligence about what they see. But I have to be candid and say that we cannot be completely reliant that the intel agencies will share what they know, because the intel agencies, like so much of our federal agencies, have succumbed to censorship by the administration, which is a dangerous position for the country to be in. So we are now increasingly reliant on the private sector I did a hearing just last week, a virtual hearing with technology company representatives to find out what are they seeing. That may be ultimately one of the best sources of information about what foreign powers are doing through social media. So these are some of the challenges that we face. There are some in particular I'm very concerned about that we can talk about. I think my paramount concern at this moment is the president is doing his best to discredit millions of people who vote by absentee ballot. And of course, foreign powers are watching this, and they will seek to amplify divisions within our society and also seek to disrupt, potentially cause chaos in an aftermath of a close election by amplifying false claims of fraudulent voting. So this is among my paramount concerns at the moment, that the foundation is being laid for a very chaotic result if this effort to discredit millions of votes continues by the president and foreign powers seek to amplify that false message. And so a lot to be concerned about and look forward to a very timely and important discussion.
Adam, thank you so much for your friendship, for participating. Anybody who knows Adam Schiff and knows me knows that in Congress we were best friends, we remain best friends, and that allows me to wish you a very happy birthday. Sunday was Congressman Schiff's birthday. Let's begin with a headline that is not pertinent to foreign influence on our election, but I think rises to the top of current topics, and that is that on Sunday you were on Meet the Press and suggested that former National Security Advisor John Bolton may soon testify before your committee. Any developments on that?
Nothing that I can report at the moment. We're certainly in discussions with leadership about the potential of bringing John Bolton in. I do think that exposing the conduct or misconduct of the administration is enormously important. And I think, for example, the hearing that the Judiciary Committee did yesterday, where it invited witnesses from the Justice Department to talk about increasing politicization of our Justice Department and our justice system, is very important disinfectant to expose these problems to sunlight. And there's obviously a great deal that John Bolton has to say regarding the president's Ukraine misconduct, efforts to enlist the help of yet other powers like China in his reelection, efforts to make criminal cases go away, cases involving US sanctions on Iran in order to please autocrats, and betrayal of US values in terms of human rights as far as the Uyghurs is concerned. A lot of issues that really, I think, bear scrutiny. But we are still in the midst of our leadership discussions about next steps.
I heard the bells in the background. Was that a call for votes or a recess? Do you know?
I think we're fine, even if it is a call for the next vote. I'm in one of the later voting groups. Because of the pandemic, we're voting in shifts now.
Can you explain?
If that was the beginning of a vote,
yeah,
I will probably have at least 45 or 50 minutes before I need to go and vote.
Take us through. I hope our viewers don't mind, but I think it's fascinating to understand that process. Can you take us through that now as a result of COVID, what the process is for voting?
Sure, and my staff just informed me that was actually the recess bells, so I'm in even better shape at the moment. Well, what we are trying to do is conduct the nation's business at a time when there are real health risks with gathering people from the four corners of the country, flying them all into the Capitol, and putting them in a relatively small space without windows. And so what we're doing is, in terms of votes on the floor, as well as the conduct of hearings, we're doing a bit of a hybrid where, yes, many of us are here and we are going to be voting in person, but we've also made provision for people to vote by proxy. Meaning that another member could in writing give me their proxy to vote in a certain way, cast a certain vote for them. It's not a open, a blank check for me to vote however I want on whatever bill I want. No, it has to be very specific on this bill, on this vote. This is how I want you to vote, and nothing beyond that. But for those of us that are here and voting, instead of all of us going to the floor at one time, were broken up into groups, 7 different groups by alphabet. So with Schiff being the last name, I get to go in the latter part of the voting. So people go onto the House floor through one door, they vote, and they leave through another door, and there's sanitizer in between. We're wearing masks, at least the vast majority of us are. Similarly, our conduct of hearings, some are in virtual form, very much like this, and some are in hybrid form, where there are witnesses present, but members are present and also members are remote. And we're trying to use technology to make sure that the business of the country goes forward, but does so in a way that doesn't jeopardize the health of not just the members, but our staff and all of those who work here on the Hill.
Let's go back to influence and manipulation. Congressman, I just finished really an extraordinary book that I commend to the attention of the folks on this conference. It's called This Is Not Propaganda by Peter Pomerantsev. And he talks about how more information, we originally thought, meant more democracy. It meant more access to understanding facts. But he writes that additional information hasn't really meant more freedom and democracy. He writes, it's created a world of influence operations run amok, where the means of manipulation have gone forth and multiplied. A world of dark ads, psyops, hacks, bots, soft facts, fake news, deep fakes, brainwashing, trolls, ISIS, Putin, Trump. You gave us a deep assessment of your concerns, but I want to just take one of those tactics because I've heard you speak about it before, and that is deep fakes. And I wonder if you can help us understand what a deep fake is and the likelihood that we will be exposed to them in this campaign.
Well, deepfake is a technology that has been dramatically improved over the last several years, where you can create a very realistic video or audio that is indistinguishable from real unless you have a machine AI that is at least as capable as the AI that generated the false video. So I could play for you right now a video of Steve Israel. It would be your image, it would be your voice, but it would not be your words. And someone, who receives that video or sees that video on social media would say, I know Steve Israel, that is Steve Israel. That's him, that's his voice, that's everything about him, that's his gestures, but it would be nothing you ever said. And that can get obviously millions and millions of views before that you could ever even attempt to disprove the veracity or the authenticity of that video. You can imagine how disruptive that would be if, for example, someone pushed out a video of Joe Biden saying something racist or misogynist or just insulting, and this was done a few weeks before the election. That would travel like wildfire, and it would take a long time for the truth to catch up with it. We did a hearing on this in the Intelligence Committee, and we did it as an open hearing so I can discuss what our witnesses had to say. I asked one of the witnesses, who I think had formerly been with DARPA, if you see, for example, that there was what's called a cheat fake, a video of Nancy Pelosi that had been slowed down and the timbre of her voice had been raised so that the net effect was it looked like she was drunk or impaired. I asked if 10 million people saw that video of Nancy Pelosi, how many would you expect would ultimately learn that that video had been doctored? So now this was a video of things that she actually said, but the manner in which she said them was altered to make her look impaired. And his answer was, well, if 10 million people saw it, you'd be lucky if 1 million ever found out that it had been altered. And psychologists will go beyond that to say, even those million that learned that what they saw was doctored may never be able to fully disabuse themselves of the negative impression that it left. So when I think back to 3.5 years ago, there was an effort to paint Hillary Clinton as in failing health. Well, if you pushed out videos, doctored videos of her, making her look like she was in failing health, then you would further cement that narrative, even though that was a false narrative. And this is the kind of pernicious new world that we're in, where that is now completely feasible. where the social media companies do not have uniform policies about what to do, where they're still playing catch up, frankly, in what to do about this kind of manipulated media. And you know, you do have to be precise because you don't want to stop people from doing parody. But at the same time, there is a real opportunity for election-altering mischief in the last weeks of an election, should this kind of thing be pushed into the social media ecosystem. One other observation, Steve. That proposition you mentioned, that more information is better, that it's the whole cornerstone of the First Amendment. I think is still the right answer, but I do think that this innovation is as disruptive as the invention of the printing press. We had centuries to get used to that innovation. I'm sure when the printing press came around, people decried the fact you could print false, libelous statements and mass produce them. But there was a long period of time to acclimate to that. The social media environment has changed with lightning speed, and we have not acclimated. And it will take us years and years to acclimate. And I think to get to a place where the abundance of information still is the right answer. In the interim, though, there is such opportunity for damage, destruction, and distortion that it is vitally concerning.
We have about 7 minutes left in our conversation, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. And Natalie Ryan will instruct our participants on how to ask a question. So just a few final questions. You, at the outset of your comments, you talked about the fact that we were in many respects blindfolded on the lengths and the extents of foreign interference in our election through social media. And then you just in your most recent comments talked about 3.5 years ago when footage of Hillary Clinton was doctored. Let's go back 4 years ago. I have a very vivid memory of you and I calling an editor at the New York Times. I'd been the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and at that point was in charge of Democratic messaging. You, of course, at the time, ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. And we were extremely frustrated with the volume of information based on stolen emails that was being reported as fact in newspapers and in broadcasts across the country. I remember we called an editor of the New York Times and made the argument that you should report whatever they want, but they should at least indicate the provenance of this information. Make it clear that the information that people were reading was obtained by malicious and potentially illegal means. And the response was, yeah, we don't think it's that, it rises to that level. Well, we now know it rose to that level. Do you think, let's talk about two things. One, what your committee is doing in order to protect the integrity of our elections from foreign interference, but also, is the media doing more in your view to protect us from receiving information that was obtained by malicious and illegal means?
Well, Steve, I remember that conversation with the editor vividly, as I'm sure you do. And, what we were urging is, first of all, not everything that's in a stolen email is newsworthy. But if they felt that things were so newsworthy that they could not ignore it, notwithstanding the fact that they knew a hostile power had stolen it and was using it to influence our election, they needed to put the context in. Too often you'd have a long discussion of what was in a stolen email, and only at the very end it would say, this email was allegedly stolen by the Russians, blah, blah, blah. And when the Clinton campaign was asked for comment, they declined to comment. That should have been, I think, at the very front to orient the readers. This is how you know this information. This is why you're being shown this information, because a hostile foreign power stole it because they wanted you to see it. I think now the far greater challenge, because I do think that the press now recognize that the degree to which they permitted this sort of distortion of the relative insignificance of a lot of what those emails had to say, and allow themselves to be used by a foreign power, will give them some circumspection about being used that way again. The bigger issue to my mind is, what role the social media companies will now play in the amplification of false and misleading content. That's obviously a very, vigorous debate going on right now, particularly with Twitter labeling a number of the president's tweets as misleading and pushing people to good documented information. It reminds me, frankly, of something that Nikita Khrushchev once said. He said that when the democracies hang themselves, the capitalists will provide the rope. And there is some, question about whether our democracy is endangering itself by the algorithmic amplification of content, not on the basis of whether it's true or not, but on the basis of what will grab our attention. And what grabs our attention are things that are fear-inducing, anger-producing, often fallacious, and in the conduct of a pandemic, that's obviously a deeply dangerous thing. In the conduct of an election, it's hazardous for the health of our democracy. We are very much pursuing these issues in Congress. In the hearing that I just had last week with the tech sector, we not only covered what they were seeing on the platforms in terms of foreign powers, and the Russians, for example, are utilizing new and more ingenious ways to hide their hand. I don't know that they're going to use the same IP addresses from St. Petersburg. They may use, as has been publicly reported, cutouts in Africa or elsewhere to disguise themselves. But we also use the opportunity to talk with the social media companies about the degree to which their algorithms are dividing America, are stovepiping Americans. And to me, this is among the most profound challenges facing the country. And that's just how we get our information now, has created such information bubbles that it makes it too hard for people to talk to each other. The final point I'd make on this subject, and my Republican friends on the call can write this off to my party affiliation, but we're in a really new world now where much of the push towards alternate facts, non-reality fictional narratives comes from the White House itself. And of course, that makes it enormously difficult for the social media companies to know what to do when it's coming from the President of the United States. And just to give the most recent illustration, the White House put out a press statement about what their pandemic task force had found in its most recent meeting within the last day or so. The White House press statement was completely distorted in terms of what the CDC and the task force was actually saying. The White House press statement made it appear that the CDC was confirming that the only reason we have increased numbers of coronavirus cases in America is because we're doing more testing. And when you have that kind of misinformation during a pandemic, but it's coming from the Oval Office, then we become part of the problem in this country in terms of global misinformation rather than part of the solution.
Final question from me. Adam, you're part of the Gang of Eight. You have more information about global threat and conflict than most members of Congress, no less members of the public and our fellow citizens. So let me ask you, knowing what you know, what keeps you up at night and what reassures you?
What keeps me up right now is something that I mentioned earlier, and that is that the administration right now is trying to persuade the American people that you can't trust votes cast by absentee ballot. Now, that would be bad under normal circumstances, because of course millions and millions of Americans, including the president and vice president, and many of us, vote by absentee ballot. That is an important and legitimate and time-tested way to vote. It is more important than ever that that be available during a pandemic. There's a lot of concern right now that there may not be a second wave because the first wave may never end, or at least it may not end by the fall. And so I think, whether we have a second wave in the fall or we're still in the first wave, people are going to need to safely vote. And discrediting how millions of Americans will need to vote is, I think, a direct threat to our democracy, but it is also an open invitation to foreign mischief. And I don't think of the variety that the president is proclaiming. The president was tweeting that, you know, foreign nations are going to be submitting millions of absentee ballots in our election. That to me just harkens back to his false claim in the last election that millions of undocumented people voted when they didn't. But nonetheless, if it's a close election, given the doubts that the president is trying to sow right now, you know, a foreign power's ability to sow confusion in the aftermath of our election will be profound. And frankly, we won't need the help of foreign powers to do it. There will already be enough consternation in that contingency. So that really does concern me. You know, the spectacle of a Bush v. Gore kind of an outcome, but where the votes of millions have been cast in doubt falsely, and foreign powers have that opportunity for mischief. And in terms of what we're doing about it, you know, in the HEROES Act, we have included a number of provisions to make sure that people can safely vote during a pandemic, that they don't have to risk their health in order to exercise that important foundational right. We require paper trails for voting technologies. We require early voting so that we don't have crowded polling places during a pandemic. But, you know, the best security, frankly, is making sure that each and every American does their civic duty and gets out and votes either by absentee or in person.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. We have a question from Professor Kreiner, a question from Wendy Abrams, and then Natalie will instruct everybody on asking their own questions. Professor.
All right. Thank you so much, Congressman Schiff, for your overview and for your thoughts and for joining us here today. So no administration likes congressional oversight. However, the current administration has taken the inevitable battle between the branches to new levels. It seemed like we had hit a new low during the impeachment inquiry, with the blanket refusals to turn over requested documents, the urgings of current and former White House personnel, including John Bolton, to defy congressional subpoenas and or request to testify before hearings. But this assault on oversight has continued unabated, with multiple high-profile firings of inspectors general, endless legal challenges to congressional subpoenas, the firing of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and just continued obstruction. So 2 quick questions, if you don't mind. First, has this war on congressional oversight hindered the Intelligence Committee's ability to keep tabs on and try to counter foreign electoral interference? And second, are there any prospects for a congressional resurgence that might claw back some of its oversight powers, particularly if the president is not reelected? Or will partisan incentives simply flip the game the other way?
Well, those are great questions, and you know, I'll use that opportunity to also answer the second part of Steve's question about what makes me optimistic. We are at a very dangerous point with this wholesale attack on Congress's oversight responsibility, and frankly, not just our oversight responsibility. The most important power of the Congress is the power of the purse. You know, I've kind of vacillated between whether the power to declare war or the power of the purse is more important. And I've come to conclude that the power of the purse is the most important, because whether you declare war or don't declare war, if you have the ability to defund a war, you have the ability to do more than make a declaration. It's the most important power that we have. And this Congress has allowed the president to also negate its power of the purse. By, in the most graphic example, funding the wall with money that was not appropriated for that purpose. And, you know, if the Congress is willing, essentially on a party line basis, to permit its most important power to be subverted, then as we ultimately saw, there's not much ground left before it will subjugate other powers to the will of the executive. And so we have relinquished much of our oversight authority as well. And that is going to have, I think, really potentially disastrous consequences if it goes beyond this administration. And, you know, what we are doing right now, which I don't expect will become law certainly within the next 4.5 months, but in the Intelligence Committee, we are drafting in consultation with other committees a whole package of what we're calling our own post-Watergate reforms. Items to strengthen these democratic norms and democratic institutions. So in the case of Congress's oversight power, we're working on legislation that would provide for expedited court process so that administration could not string us out in court endlessly in order to avoid oversight. So that a court would have a set period to rule on enforcement actions of congressional subpoenas, for example. Just to give you an illustration, and this is a timely one, John Bolton on his book tour has been criticizing the Congress for not investigating other issues or compelling, I guess, his own appearance. Now he's had trouble articulating why he needed to be compelled when he didn't need to be compelled to write all this in a book. But nonetheless, we did try to compel and are trying to compel Don McGahn and have been trying to compel him to testify for over a year. We would still be in court with John Bolton if we chose to allow the administration to play rope-a-dope with us in the courts. And so we're going to have better enforcement mechanisms. We thought that being able to hold people in criminal contempt was sufficient, but given that the administration and the Justice Department is led by Bill Barr, of course, there's zero chance of the Justice Department enforcing a congressional subpoena against the will of the president. And so we're going to have to use statutory means to effectuate new norms after this administration is over. I think that those provisions will have bipartisan support. And, as I said during the trial, I hope and pray that we never have a president in the Democratic Party like Donald Trump. But if we did, that I also hope that I would stand up to that president. And if the president abuses power the way this one has, I would impeach that president. I do think that this is something we haven't seen before, where one party has been so willing to tie itself to the president that it is willing to sacrifice its own institutional prerogatives. That I don't know whether the founders, even with their concern over factionalism, contemplated. They felt that the Congress would have enough respect for its own institution to fight for its institutional interests, but that has not happened with the GOP in Congress. And that's made all of these accretions of congressional power possible. But I do think that there will be bipartisan support. I do hope and pray that the Democratic Party will not allow itself to be bent to a Democratic president's will the way this president has done this Republican majority to his will. And the final thing I would say on this point is, and this gets to Steve's question, what makes me optimistic? I believe in this country. We are a resilient people. We are a resilient democracy. We're being tested like never before, but we will pass the test ultimately. I have no doubt that we will survive this period. We'll survive the pandemic. We'll survive this presidency. The question is, how much damage will be done in the meantime? How long will it take us to mitigate that damage? In the case of the pandemic, how much more loss of life will we have to suffer? And in terms of our democracy, how much longer will it take us to restore those institutions and our standing around the world? The scene we saw the other day, somebody, the chair of Intel, who works with other nations around the world and parliamentarians around the world, the scene we saw the other day of people banging on the glass to try to get in and vote, broadcast around the world. You can imagine what our friends and allies think about the state of American democracy. It breaks my heart. But at the end of the day, I believe in this country. I believe in our future. We will recover from this. And we just need to make sure we build back better.
Thank you so much, Congressman Schiff. Wendy Abrams, and then Natalie will instruct people to ask their own questions.
Thank you. And I have to apologize because I was so brief in my introduction that I gave such a long and accomplished resume, and I wanted to get to your remarks. I neglected to mention your role previously serving in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles for 6 years and successfully prosecuting the first FBI agent ever indicted for espionage. But so now mentioning that in your background in the U.S. Attorney's Office, I'm curious as to your perspective and insights into the recent firing of the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, Berman, and the consequences that has.
Well, you know, it is, I think, it has to be viewed as part of a pattern with the Attorney General, a pattern of misrepresenting what was in the Mueller report, of intervening in the sentencing of one friend of the president, Roger Stone, of intervening in the entire case involving Michael Flynn to dismiss a case in which the defendant pled guilty not once but twice, and now trying to remove a very independent U.S. attorney from a very independent U.S. Attorney's Office. Southern District of New York has a history of independence, prosecutorial independence from Main Justice, which is what cost Mr. Berman his job. And you know, the fact that the Attorney General misled people about that non-resignation at the time that he did merely makes it that much more egregious. It is a period of tremendous demoralization within the department. When you see career prosecutors have to abandon their cases because of political interference. I think that Don Ayers, who testified yesterday, former Deputy Attorney General under George Bush, when he talked about the rule of law being more endangered now than at any point since Watergate, and in fact, even including Watergate, I think that's tragically exactly right. You know, people around the country now going into courtrooms are going to be made to wonder, is this case being brought for a political reason? Because that is certainly the perception that Bill Barr has given that department. And I think the reality he's given in terms of intervening to protect the president's friends. So I think there's a reason why Mr. Berman, in his statement, said that he was going to stay put. This was early on in that 24 to 48 hour massacre, because he wanted to ensure that the investigations went on with integrity. It certainly is his concern that that was the motivation behind his firing. And I have no doubt that the desire by the president and the Attorney General to have a Trump loyalist in that position is what's behind this firing, behind the desire to put in that position apparently golfing buddy of the president's with no prosecutorial experience. So it's a time of great peril. And you know, another factor that may be driving this is the Southern District of New York indicted Michael Cohen for a campaign fraud scheme in which they would later argue that he should go to jail. Now, in that indictment, they said that Michael Cohen was coordinated and directed by individual number one. And I'm sure it has occurred to the president as individual number one that if the Justice Department is arguing that Michael Cohen should go to jail for his participation in a campaign fraud scheme in which he was directed and coordinated, it's hard to argue that the guy who did the coordinating and directing shouldn't face the same sanction. And so I think trying to purge that U.S. Attorney's Office of its leadership may be motivated by concerns over what it has already investigated and what it may be investigating as well with regard to Mr. Giuliani or his associates.
All right, Natalie, would you please give instructions on how people can pose questions?
Absolutely. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a raise hand function, and that's how you can get in the queue to ask questions. We've already had some people lining up. So our first question will come from Mr. Ted Beer. Mr. Beer, if you could just unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Congressman, my question would be, when Trump loses by a narrow margin and then claims the election was rigged and refuses to leave, what's going to happen ultimately when the inauguration date arrives, and what happens during the lame duck period when we have a president who says, I didn't lose, and the votes say he did lose?
Well, you know, this is, as I mentioned, is a great concern of mine. Now, my concern is a bit different than you hear expressed by some. I'm not worried that the president is going to call out the military and try to bring about some kind of a military coup. I have confidence that the military, notwithstanding the serious mistakes they made with respect to that photo opportunity, I have every confidence the military would not obey an unconstitutional order of that kind. I do worry about a very close result in which the president has laid the foundation to discredit the result, in particular to discredit the millions of people who vote by absentee ballot. I do worry about that. And, you know, I don't know that we can clearly foresee what the consequences of that would be if there were a contested result. Now, if the president simply makes wholesale claims of fraud the way he did after the last election, I think that he will be repudiated by everyone, except for a handful of diehard supporters. I certainly hope and pray that that's the case. And, you know, the best thing, frankly, that we can do, because, you know, that kind of a contested result could lead to great uncertainty and chaos. The best thing we can do is to make sure that it is not a close result, and to make sure that the result is in fact overwhelming. Obviously, from my perspective, I hope it's an overwhelming repudiation of the president and what he stands for. But I do have that concern that you expressed, that in the event of a close result or contested result, that there is no clear path. The degree to which the country was ready to accept a judgment of the Supreme Court, even a judgment that many of us found was not based on law, did not follow precedent. The degree to which, you know, I think the public would have confidence in a Supreme Court adjudication of a contested result, I think would be at an all-time low. And like so many other institutions now, the Supreme Court is increasingly viewed as a partisan institution rather than a conservative one. And in that context, it's not a body you want to go to resolve some kind of a contested finish.
All right, Natalie, next question, please.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from Mr. Marty Scheinman. Mr. Scheinman, if you can go ahead and unmute your microphone.
Hi, Congressman. How are you? Everybody's talking about, you know, it's all over in November. My prism is different. I think that they have 7 months that they're going to be in charge of the levers of government, notwithstanding my hopefulness for November. And I know we're exhausted about inquiry and about impeachment, but this stuff with the DOJ left unchecked for these months, it seems to me, is more than mischief, is downright dangerous. Don't you think that this is something that we have to do, notwithstanding our exhaustion?
Well, you know, I certainly concur with you about the profound danger at the Justice Department because, you know, it's bad enough when a Justice Department is seeking leniency or dismissal of cases involving its friends. It's a far more serious matter when it uses the Justice Department to persecute or prosecute the president's enemies. So we may see worse yet to come. And so I share your deep concern about the phenomenal damage that Bill Barr is doing to the department and its reputation. In courtrooms, I think, across America, defense counsel are going to be given new opportunities to argue that the cases before them are bogus. Because of the actions of the Attorney General, it's going to make the work of people like myself, assistant U.S. attorneys all around the nation, FBI agents all around the nation, that much more difficult. You know, whether we go beyond exposure of the Attorney General's misconduct and the increasing politicization of the department and the danger it poses, whether we go beyond that will be a decision that Chairman Nadler will make in consultation with the Speaker and our caucus, ultimately the Speaker's call. So I will leave it to their good judgment, but I think that we certainly need to expose whatever that office is doing in order to protect the public. That is, I think, very much a necessity. Whether it will make sense to go beyond that, given the realities of the Senate and the degree to which it is almost lockstep with the president, no matter how it may pervert the interest of justice, I will leave to our leadership to decide.
Thank you. Natalie, before we go to the next question, in the interests of equal time, I do want to share a question from Bob Friedrich from New York, if I may. This is a different perspective than the one that you may have, Congressman Schiff, but I think we do owe him some equal time. He says, if the FBI believed that there was collusion with Russia from members of the Trump inner circle, why didn't they notify him of it so he could take appropriate action, similar to the notification that was provided Senator Feinstein on a staffer involved in foreign espionage? You have a response to that?
I do, and certainly I think that on the basis of what the FBI was seeing in 2017, they had ample reason for concern and an ample predicate to open an investigation. And I think the question that they had to analyze at the time is who is involved in this scheme, and by notifying someone, do you risk exposure of the investigation at a time where you need to gather evidence to determine how broad that collusion may be. And so I think they were in a difficult position. I believe that they gave general defensive briefings to both candidates and talked about what hostile foreign powers may be doing. And the issue may involve more whether they briefed or should brief a president of people on his campaign who are having secret contacts with a hostile power. I think that given that the president in public was urging the Russians to essentially hack his opponent's emails, they had reason to be concerned with whether the president himself might be implicated. And so I think that's a very difficult position for the FBI to be in. I hope it's certainly not a position that any FBI director is in again. But my sense is, while there are general defensive briefings, the concern about talking about specific individuals, including the president's campaign chairman, his acting national security or incoming national security advisor, without knowing whether the president himself was implicated, made that a very difficult call for the FBI.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from Faith Fisher. Faith, if you can unmute, please, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there. So you discussed the importance of social media platforms in election security matters. And I was wondering, to what extent are social media platforms expected to be enforcers of the truth? And how are election security concerns changing this, especially with how you balance this with First Amendment rights?
And Adam, before you answer, let me tell you that Faith is one of our distinguished summer fellows, a student at Cornell.
Excellent. Well, Faith, that's a very good, I think, important and difficult question. I think the social media companies take the position that's not their role at all, except in very exceptional cases where the misinformation could do harm. Now, it's obviously to their economic advantage to take that position that we are essentially a billboard or a poster board that people can post whatever message they want, and they don't have any control over content. But they do have, I think, a civic responsibility not to be pushing out, amplifying content that affirmatively does harm to people. And they've shown a willingness to take down information or suppress information, for example, that's false about the pandemic that could cause people to become sick or lose their lives. And in other cases, they've shown a willingness to do it, but not very much. Even in, I think, the most clear-cut cases where you have political advertising, they wish to be held by a different standard than, for example, if you place the same ad on broadcast TV. I don't think the standard should be different, certainly not for advertising. I don't think that Facebook should accept knowingly false ads. I don't think they should enrich themselves by accepting money to run those ads. And I think they should run the same due diligence that a network would do if it was asked to air something false or incendiary or, call to violence. So the question becomes, what about those gray areas where it is a question of spin rather than a question of truth or falsity? I think there are so many quite clear examples of demonstrably false statements that damage our democracy, that they can utilize independent fact checkers and they can moderate the content on their platforms and make sure that they're not being utilized to propagate, amplify false information. And so I think they have a responsibility to do so, as others do that convey information. And yes, there'll be difficult cases, but so many of the easy cases the social media companies are not acting upon, let alone getting into those cases of gray area. Now, how do we encourage the companies to do that? After all, the federal government isn't going to tell them what they can say or not say, post or not post, that infringes in any way on the First Amendment. It is different if a company develops different user policies than if the government tries to censor speech. But we also don't have to give the tech companies immunity for what they run on their platforms that they know to be false. And we don't have to prevent people's right of action if they are defamed or libeled by what is the content that is amplified on their platforms, or if their algorithms do affirmative harm to people that can be proven in a court of law. So there are things that we can do short of the US government becoming some kind of an arbiter of truth or falsity. But I do think that the companies themselves need to be better corporate citizens. It may mean they need to look at their business models, which have the effect, because amplification is based on what gains attention, and that has the effect of accentuating the extremes. They may need to think about whether their business model is tearing apart the fabric of our society. And Congress certainly needs to think about whether they should continue to enjoy an immunity if that is their business model.
Natalie, before we go to our final question, let me just remind folks that tomorrow at 1 o'clock, Democracy 2020, the protests in U.S. democracy. Wednesday, July 1st, an inside briefing on U.S. elections with David Axelrod and former Republican Congressman Tom Davis, in conjunction with Tel Aviv University, being streamed in Israel, but open to audiences here. And folks should go to iopga.cornell.edu. With that, let's take the final question, then I'll properly thank my friend Adam Schiff.
Great. Our final question is from Mr. Bob Katz. Mr. Katz, if you can go ahead and unmute.
Bob is, of course, a trustee emeritus at Cornell University.
As somebody once said, meaning I deserve to be a trustee, and I'm out as a trustee at the same time. In other words, I deserve to be out. Happy birthday, Congressman. I think I probably find it just as unbelievable as you do what the number is, so I won't mention it. I'm also, I guess, I'm probably the only person who shares an alma mater with Marty Scheinman, Adam Schiff, and Bill Barr, at least on this call. So that's my disclosure. One of the bright spots, a few bright spots, I guess, has been the degree of cooperation that has obtained within Senate intel up to this point between Warner and Burr, and Mark said last night on a call that things are going pretty well with Rubio so far on the Senate side. Can you offer any hope for optimism on the functionality, return to functionality in House intel, given who you've had to deal with, which, by the way, I'm doing whatever I can to help you change?
Well, thanks for the question. You know, the good news, bad news story about the House Intelligence Committee is the bad news is quite obvious. Our, oceans-wide gulf between my view of the world and Devin Nunes. The good news is that notwithstanding our considerable differences on the president's Ukraine misconduct, on Russia, on any number of important issues affecting the administration, we have nonetheless produced an intelligence authorization bill together every year that we have served as chair and ranking member, through thick and thin. And through most of those years, notwithstanding the bipartisan comity between Mr. Warner and Mr. Burr, they were not able to do that until last year. And so, ironically, we've had a better track record of passing intelligence bills in our committee than the Senate. You know, the other thing I would say about our committee, and this is not certainly an illustration of bipartisan harmony, but nonetheless, if it were not for our committee in the House, the country would have never known about the president's Ukraine misconduct. And if the president of the United States is withholding military aid from an ally at war to seek help in cheating in the next election, the country needs to know about it. And if it means that that disrupts the comity of the committee, then it disrupts the comity of the committee. But misconduct of that nature can't be ignored in the interest of getting along to go along. In terms of what the prospects are in the future, you know, I would hope that we'll be able to continue working on the Intelligence Authorization Act. And just for background, that act is the product of the entire year's worth of oversight. So we do oversight of all of the agencies with hearings, with field visits. We look at their budgets. We start new initiatives. We put in new privacy and civil liberties protections. All of that work product over the course of a year is rolled into that Intelligence Authorization Act. And so we've been able to do all that work unimpeded through thick and thin. So my hope is that that will continue at a minimum. You know, in terms of getting back to a more cordial relationship, and, you know, in the pre-Trump era, Devin Nunes and I worked together quite well. We were, you know, I guess what you would call friends in a legislative way. That changed with this presidency. You know, I think too much water has gone under the bridge for that to change after this presidency. But nonetheless, I'm going to continue to do my part with the members of the committee, the GOP members of the committee who are willing and interested in working in a bipartisan, nonpartisan basis to do so. And I've endeavored to do that through thick and thin with the conduct of our hearings and our oversight work. I incorporate GOP ideas and interests in the intelligence work product and the hearings that we do. So I'm going to do my part, and I can only hope that they will do theirs.
Terrific, thanks.
Our chat room is flooded with more questions and comments. The recurring theme in the chat room is thanking you for your leadership, for your intelligence, for your service. I got to see it up close and firsthand in 16 years that we served together and the many experiences that we shared. We're all counting on you, no matter what side of the aisle we may be on, we're counting on your kind of leadership to see us through these times. And again, we thank you for that leadership and for participating with us today.
Well, Steve, you know, if I could, thank you for inviting me. And, you know, you are a fabulous colleague. You remain a wonderful, wonderful friend. And I think what you're doing through the Institute, the broad array of voices from both parties, from no party affiliation, is phenomenal. You know, we all need to be able to listen to people, whatever our perspectives or theirs may be. That's the key, I think, to healing some of the divides in the country and moving the nation forward. So I really applaud what you're doing and what the Institute is doing.
Well, thank you. We would all sing happy birthday to you, but Zoom would probably revoke our license. But we do wish you a happy birthday. Professor Kreiner, Wendy Abrams, to all our participants, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you again tomorrow. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Take care now. Thank you.